oxygen is inhaled in the lungs. Once inhaled in the lungs, it then hops from the lungs onto hemoglobin, which is in red blood cells. And they literally glow red in color when they're saturated with oxygen. That blood then circulates around the body until it finds a busy cell. And there the oxygen hops off hemoglobin in order to go to the mitochondria, so that the mitochondria can use oxygen to burn fuel. And that the red cells then turn a slightly bluish color, and those red cells return to the lungs in venous circulation. So the big question is, how is it that oxygen knows to get onto hemoglobin in the lungs and hop off it when it gets to a mitochondria where it's needed? Because if it was the other way around, then, that would be a disaster. That would mean the whole thing would fail the whole system would fail very quickly. And the answer to this question is acidity. And the acidity in the blood is generated by carbon dioxide. So when mitochondria are busy, when they are burning fuel in the presence of oxygen, they generate carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide dissolves in the plasma as a weak carbonic acid. So the plasma becomes acid and the hemoglobin becomes slightly acid. And in acid circumstances, hemoglobin dissociates, the oxygen hops off and it supplies the mitochondria. And of course, that's a totally desirable state of affairs. By contrast, in the lungs, as we exhale, we're washing carbon dioxide out of the lungs. And in doing so, the blood becomes slightly alkali. And if the blood is slightly alkali, then oxygen sticks onto hemoglobin. So this obviously makes perfect physiological sense. And this is such an important idea that I'm just going to repeat myself here. So lungs, low carbon dioxide, alkali blood, so oxygen sticks to hemoglobin. Conversely, in the mitochondria, which of course is every living cell in our body, high levels of carbon dioxide, acidic blood, so oxygen is released from hemoglobin. I say, totally desirable state of affairs. Now, all this worked perfectly until we upset carbon dioxide levels in the blood. I mean, one of the things I've always asked myself is, why did we evolve such an inefficient method of breathing? If we really wanted to be incredibly efficient about gaseous exchange, then we'd have lungs like a fish, where the air comes in one way and it goes out another way. But by breathing in the same air that we exhale seems, very inefficient to me. And the answer is that without that, we would lose too much carbon dioxide. So respiration is, yes, it's about getting oxygen, but it's all about hanging on to carbon dioxide so the acidity of the blood is just right. Now, we get into problems when we overbreathe. And many people, for many reasons, overbreathe. It's often driven by the stress hormone adrenaline. And of course, we all know what the major cause of adrenaline is, and that's falling levels of blood sugar. So when people are fueling their body on sugars and carbohydrates, their blood sugar goes up and down and up and down. Every time their blood sugar goes up, there's an outpouring of insulin in order to bring blood sugar levels down, and that sugar is shunted into fat. Then blood sugar levels fall precipitously. The brain panics. Where am I going to get my next fuel from? And there's a spike of adrenaline. And one of the effects of adrenaline, in addition to high blood pressure and feeling stressed and wild but tired, but one of the effects is it can drive respiration, so we end up overbreathing. Now, of course, from an evolutionary perspective, this is a very desirable thing, because most stressful situations for primitive women walking through the jungle would have been followed up by, running a mile, sprinting, and therefore oxygen would have been highly necessary. But for most of us, most people, they hyperventilate, they're not using up ATP, and we have the disastrous metabolic effect is we wash carbon dioxide out of the bloodstream. And therefore blood becomes too alkali, and therefore oxygen sticks to hemoglobin, and there it remains stuck. So your oxygen levels in the blood can be very good. They can be 100%. But if your blood is too alkali, then the oxygen remains trapped on hemoglobin. So mitochondria are starved of oxygen and symptoms result. If you starve mitochondria of oxygen, they go slowly, and maybe you go into anaerobic metabolism. And these are all the symptoms of poor energy delivery, which I'm not going to repeat. But the point is, if you don't get energy to your brain, the brain goes slow. If you don't get energy to your body, the body goes slow, and so on. But there are some symptoms of hyperventilation that give you a clue that this is the issue. And the first thing is people often mouth breathe. Now, the problem with mouth breathing is there is what I call dead space. What we should all be doing is nose breathing. And therefore, as we exhale air, more of that exhaled air is therefore re-inhaled. So we hang on to carbon dioxide better when we nose breathe than when we mouth breathe. And of course, if you are mouth breathing, then you end up with a dry mouth. You can also end up with tooth decay and gum disease because microbes in the mouth love oxygen. But another really interesting facet of long-term mouth breathing is it actually changes the anatomy of the jaw and the face, because the body is incredibly responsive to various stresses. And if we nose breathe, then that opens up the nose, opens up the airways, and allows the jaw to develop properly. And what we see with people who breathe through their mouth is nose obstruction, crowded teeth, and an undershot jaw. So the pressures in the upper airways actually pull the whole shape of that, and chewing, of course, pull the shape into shape, the whole of the face and the mouth into shape. Sinusitis. If you're mouth breathing, you're not aerating your sinuses well, and therefore there's a tendency to be blocked. And it's the old story: if you don't use it, you lose it. The more you mouth breathe, the more you breathe, the more your nose becomes blocked. And again, the more the nose becomes blocked, the more you mouth breathe. And we'll talk about breathing exercises in a little bit. Snoring and sleep apnea, because again, the upper airways are not inflated properly. They become a bit edematous. They're prone to collapse. And that can result in either it can result in obstructive sleep apnea, i.e. snoring. Asthma, all asthmatics hyperventilate. Buteyko, and we're going to talk about the Buteyko methods, was a Ukrainian and fought very bravely during the Second World War, and then got involved in hospitals subsequently. And he noticed that many of the people he was looking after, he wasn't a qualified doctor at that point, he just observed this through his own, using his own common sense. And he noticed that many of the people who had breathing problems were actually hyperventilating. Now, at that point, he didn't understand the mechanics of it, but he seemed to instinctively know that to teach people to slow down their breathing, doing the breathing exercises could be helpful. And guess what? It was remarkably helpful. And the Buteyko exercises and asthma, the bronchoconstriction of asthma probably represents an attempt by the body to retain CO2. But unfortunately, it has the opposite effect. So again, Buteyko exercises, which we'll talk about in a jiffy, very helpful for asthma and very helpful for chronic obstructive airways disease as well. Instead, if you do have anybody with chronic obstructive airways disease, that might be blocked nose, stuffy nose, polyps, sinusitis, this is so often allergy as well. And as a routine, avoid dairy products, because dairy products are markedly, they have a great tendency to produce catarrhal conditions. And again, I'm a great fan of iodine, but we'll come on to that. Another clue here is when you are, if you're not delivering oxygen efficiently to the tissues, it drives the autonomic nervous system and we get imbalances there. So too much sympathetic drive puts it into fight or flight mechanism, which with all those symptoms associated there. Blood pressure, tachycardia, feeling wired but tired. And you get too little parasympathetic action, which is all the what I call the rest and digest, or what we call the rest and digest functions, and poor gut function. Now, there's another really important part about this, because when people hyperventilate, broadly speaking, they're using the wrong muscles to breathe. They're using their chest muscles to breathe instead of the diaphragmatic muscles. Now, so learning diaphragmatic breathing is going to be very, very important. And it's important for at least two other reasons. I was intrigued. I mean, one of the questions I've always asked myself, and not really knowing the answer to, is how does blood get back to the heart? We know how the blood gets from the heart. The heart pumps, it creates a pressure, and so do the arteries, and that pumps blood, around the system to the capillaries. We know how blood circulates through the capillaries, and that has much to do with fourth phase water. It's basically, there's no physical pressure difference between the arteries coming in, the veins going out. It's driven by electrical forces. But how does blood get from the veins, of the veins in our legs, for example, back to the heart? Because, where's the pump that does that? And the answer is the diaphragm is very, very important here. Now, all veins have valves in them, so the blood can only go one way. And what the diaphragm does as it descends, as we breathe in, is it squashes the veins in the abdomen, and that pushes blood into the chest cavity. So the positive pressure in the abdomen as we use our diaphragms, and the negative pressure that generates in the chest shoots blood into the chest cavity and therefore back to the heart. So effectively, it's sucking blood. I mean, we can see how venous blood can return from the head and the neck and from the arms. Gravity, of course, is very helpful. But the diaphragm is the main pump that sucks venous blood back into the chest cavity so it can be recycled. And I was fascinated to learn that the diaphragm is actually heavier than the heart. So the diaphragm arguably does, as much work as the heart does, because, of course, it's not just venous return that's important. It's also we need the diaphragm to inflate our lungs. The other thing that the diaphragm does is it massages the whole of the gut. So the liver, the pancreas, the spleen, the kidneys, it stimulates blood flow in the gut and also lymphatic circulation in the gut. So the diaphragm is a much more important organ than I think anybody we've really understood. And symptomatic of that is when people who had serious COVID were put on ventilators, of course, that ventilates the lungs in a completely incorrect way. It ventilates the lungs on a positive pressure system rather than a negative pressure system. And we know putting people on ventilators was very unhelpful for people with severe COVID. It didn't do them much good at all. So, and another important thing to note here is that people often use, or physicians and therapists often use a pulse oximeter to measure levels of hemoglobin in the blood. And I beg your pardon, to measure levels of oxygen that's on hemoglobin. And that's what it does. It doesn't measure oxygen delivery to the tissues. That's another thing. So, if you are hyperventilating, your blood could be 100% saturated with oxygen. But if the oxygen can't get to the mitochondria to do the business, then you're going to suffer all the problems of poor energy delivery mechanisms. So good oxygen saturation does not mean you've got good oxygen delivery to the tissues. So now we know how to diagnose overbreathing. We've got the clinical picture there. So how do we prevent it? And essentially, these are Buteyko exercises. He was a very clever man. We'll touch on him in a moment. And the first thing, and there are three aspects to this. First of all, learn to nose breathe, and always nose breathe, even if that means taping your mouth at night. Secondly, learn to breathe with your diaphragm. And thirdly, slow the breathing down. Now, if your nostrils are a bit blocked, let's say cut out the dairy products, and then open up the airways, maybe using wintergreen or eucalyptus or something like that, and then once open, sniff iodine. I'm so cross with myself. I've just realised I left my salt pipe up in the summer house. But sniffing iodine through a salt pipe is extremely helpful for almost any respiratory problem, because iodine is both anti-infective, so it contact kills all microbes at 10 parts per million. So anybody with with acute infection or a chronic infection, a chronic sinusitis, pharyngitis, laryngitis, bronchitis, bronchiectasis, chronic obstructive airways disease, sniffing iodine is incredibly helpful. I've now got 5 patients with chronic bronchiectasis who, before coming to see me, went from one infection to one antibiotic and a bit better, and then another infection, another antibiotic and a bit better. And of course, you risk ending up with an MRSA, which is real bad news. Since starting on all the regimes that I do, ketogenic diet, supplements, and sniffing iodine, their need for antibiotics has dropped to nearly 0. So iodine is a great way to help keep the airways open. And learn to breathe in one nostril and then the other. That's the starting point of breathing exercises. What's so interesting is sometimes one's a bit blocked and one's a bit open, and sometimes the other one's blocked and it's the other way around. The nose itself sometimes shut down one side and then the other side. But nature intends us to breathe through our nose. I can't think of another mammal that doesn't breathe through its nose at rest. All other mammals, my little dog, my horse, the sheep out there, the cows, they all nose breathe. Yes, if they're running for their lives, then they will breathe through their mouths, but at rest, 99% of the time, they're nose breathing, and so should we. So first of all, learn to nose breathe and clear out the nasal passages. And once they're cleared out, keep them shut. Even when you're exercising, even when you're walking around the garden and doing stuff, don't mouth breathe, keep your mouth shut. Okay, the second thing to do is to breathe with your diaphragm. And people who hyperventilate often use their chest muscles. We should use the diaphragm largely for all the reasons we've talked about. Improves venous return, improves parasympathetic function, and is actually more efficient. So those are how to do it. So initially, put your hand on your chest and put your hand on your tummy. And breathe. So this hand, this hand, which is my right hand, looks like the left hand on the screen. I have to say it must be a mirror image. So the hand on your chest anyway, stay still, and your hand on your tummy, comes up and down as you use your diaphragm to breathe. So that's the second part of the exercise. And the third part is to slow your breathing down. And normal activity, we should be breathing 5 to 6 times a minute. But when we do these exercises, aim to slow the breathing down. Now, the reason we do this is because that increases carbon dioxide levels in the bloodstream, and therefore the blood becomes a little bit more acidic, and that greatly improves oxygen delivery to the tissues. So that's why we're doing these. And it takes a little bit of practice. So we have to make, the respiratory center isn't sensitive to oxygen. It's sensitive to carbon dioxide levels. And initially, it won't like that. You will get a sensation of air hunger. Oh, must take another breath in order to wash out that carbon dioxide. So you have to use these exercises to retrain the respiratory center to be happy by being a little bit more acidic. And it should be very easy to get the breathing down. So you're just breathing 3 breaths a minute. So those are the routine of cycles. You're welcome to have this handout. Start with the full cycle every 10 seconds and then to 15 seconds and then to 20 seconds. I found it was even possible to get down to just 2 breaths a minute and feel quite comfortable with that. Whoops, I've jumped ahead of myself. I'm a shocker for doing this. But again, as I mentioned before, diaphragmatic breathing also improves the circulation. It's essential for venous return to the heart. And of course, cardiac output is proportionate to the stroke volume, the amount of blood entering the heart. So when we when we breathe in, we're sending a jet of blood into the heart. And therefore the stroke volume increases, and so the heart beats a little bit faster. And so what you will find is as you breathe in, the heart rate increases a bit, and then as you breathe out, it slows down a little bit. And a measure of this is called the heart rate variability, the degree to which the heart rate varies from one beat to the next. And if you've got a good heart rate variability, that tells us, if you've got a large variability, that tells us you're healthy. And I think it's a reflection of diaphragmatic breathing. You've got diaphragmatic breathing that impacts directly on the heart rate variability. There are other things you can do to retrain your breathing. Singing is very good. People who sing learn breathing exercises, humming, playing an instrument, dee-da, dee-da, dee-da. But again, when you're out in the garden or walking and jogging, try to keep your mouth shut. And I say it's difficult. I now know that I was a mouth breather. I now know that, I was probably prone to hyperventilation. And so I work hard on this too. And one of the characters who learned this from Buteyko directly is an amazing athlete called Emil Zatopek. And his first Olympics that he went to, I think, was 1952. And at that Olympics, he trained running by nose breathing. He kept his mouth shut. He made his respiratory center very tolerant of carbon dioxide. And what that meant is that his oxygen delivery to his muscles was very good. And as a result of learning the Wim Hof method, he became a very successful athlete. I think it was the 1952, he won the 5,000 meters, gold medal. He won the 10,000 meters, gold medal. And then he decided to have a go at the marathon. He'd never even run a marathon before, let alone win one. And he won gold medal in that too. So it worked for him. Now, the opposite of slowing down the breathing, the opposite of Buteyko is Wim Hof breathing. And I'm sure many of you have heard of him. He is a quite extraordinary person. And he essentially does the opposite of slowing breathing. He does hyperventilation and then hold the breath. And I ran a Wim Hof weekend at my home here. And we didn't have Wim Hof himself, unfortunately, but we had colleague Dr. Dar, who's a superb trainer. And what's so fascinating, after forced hyperventilation, it's then very easy to hold your breath for maybe 2 or 3 minutes. It's quite extraordinary sensation. And my guess is the reason why hyperventilation is good is because it stimulates endogenous endorphins. That's only a guess, but I mean, the sensation certainly equates with that. And here's a picture of Wim Hof, who climbed up Everest. He seems to be able to control his autonomic nervous system through his breathing techniques. And that means he can control his body temperature consciously, or he's learned to control it consciously, his heart rate, his breathing, and that allowed him to climb Everest with, in a pair of shorts and sandals. I mean, it's just mind-blowing what that guy does. So, in summary, to get oxygen to our mitochondria, we need to breathe less. We need to do the Buteyko breathing techniques, which is nose breathing, breathing with your diaphragm, and slowing your breathing down. And when you have arrived, when you've got it right, because of what's called a controlled pause. And the way you do that is when you're just, whatever you're doing normally, breathe in normally, and then breathe out slowly, until air hunger says you've got to breathe again. And you should be able to get to 40 or 45 seconds fairly comfortably. I can just about get a bit of a gasp at the end, I have to say, but that tells you that your respiratory center is then tolerant to the carbon dioxide, and you've done a good job of retraining it. So I hope that that's just that. And the other point is, how often do we have to do these exercises? I don't like asking my patients to do interventions, which are time-consuming, difficult, cost lots of money, These breathing exercises anybody can do. Do them first thing in the morning when you wake up. When you're sitting down watching the television, do them then. Last thing at night before you go to sleep, do them then. So they become part of your regular everyday routine. And then you just incorporate it into your life, and then you find you've covered another base.